Hey guys, Socialist Links here. As you probably saw in my one of my videos, I was talking about the labor theory of value and the subjective theory of value. Between kind of like the labor theory of value and subjective theory of value, what actually determines one's value or what determines a product's value entirely within the economic system of capitalism, and how essentially is value really determined based on to the actual understanding of value, or on how pricing is essentially determined on said value in the entirety of the market. Um, I guess I gave my video on. I guess I gave my like essentially takes on it, and basically gave I guess like what I essentially understand from the labor theory of value, and I guess the better off understanding of value in the first place, and how this essentially works under capitalism. However, I stumbled across a video talking about labor theory of value and the subjective theory of value of one person being pro on the subjective theory of value, which I myself am not pro on. I'm against the entire idea of the subjective theory of value. I don't think that it applies to capitalism at all today, at all. As of a way to essentially better understand the entirety of economics, um, or at least the labor theory of value into this context of capitalism, I think it's better to understand. Essentially, I guess it's better to understand, or better to essentially look at this video and essentially make a response to this, or critique. Well, I guess like kind of like I guess a lot of knowledge onto the subjective theory of value. And that's essentially what this video is essentially here for. So without further ado, I'm going to respond to the labor theory of value debunked by the subjective theory of value by Matty's Modern Life. So here we go.
Why is this worth $10, this worth $300, and this worth $2,000? Why is anything worth its price? Economists have been grappling with this question for hundreds of years. It's hard to answer because while junk food feeds you and keeps you alive, in a sense, this is intrinsically worthless.
What do you mean they're worthless, Matty? Aren't diamonds a girl's best friend?
Nah, diamonds are intrinsically worthless, short bus.
What? Who says?
The world's largest diamond mining company. Former CEO of the De Beers Corporation, Nicky Oppenheimer, said, "Diamonds are intrinsically worthless, except for the deep psychological need they fill." He sold out of De Beers in 2012 to multinational group Anglo American, a mining company his grandfather started in 1917. Old Nick owns 1% of this company now too. It's fair to say Little Nicky is a rich bloke, but his family earned it and they gave it to him so he can spend and invest the money however he likes.
But if they
So basically, right off the bat, he basically tries and says that diamonds are essentially not worth anything except for the physiological need that essentially plays out for people, which is just simply not true. And because diamonds are essentially one of the most useful resources to essentially create tools and to create and to create tools and create other production forces that essentially is needed for our society to function, for us to essentially get more diamonds or to get more gold and all of these other factors that essentially we can sell onto the market either by as a commodities or kind of needs, or kind of like needs of someone for that exchange, basically food, water, medicine, or even commodities such as probably probably a widget or carpet or something. Any form of these entirety of any forms of these of commodity production. That's essentially kind of like what it's there for. Diamonds are not essentially useless just because it are not useless like materially. They are very useful. They essentially are used for essentially tools, and they are usually used entirely in mining companies. They're and even then we have to essentially consider also even then the labor time, or the time that essentially it took in for that diamond to be found in the first place by someone going into Western Asia, or for someone going into Northern Africa to try and find those diamonds in the first place. I can care less of what the schmuck guy that owned a diamond company has to really say. The fact The fact is that there is that like even then the people that essentially found that diamond had to essentially preserve it, cultivate it, and like essentially import it to into the rest of the world where he found that in, and also it must have taken a long time to essentially even be able to go that deep onto the ground to be able to even find diamonds in the first place. So, for this person to basically say diamonds are essentially useless, other than its philosophical need, not really, because it's taken a long time and it's taken a majority of labor time to put into that. So, you know, uh, so yeah, just really immediately false off the bat.
His mind has worked harder than he did.
Great question, Short Bus. You see, the value you add to society doesn't derive from how hard you work, so it won't necessarily be reflected in your economic worth. But many people still disagree with this fact. They think people add value through hard work alone. What these people subscribe to is the labour theory of value, and today I'm going to explain to you exactly why it's not only wrong, but extremely dangerous.
And I'm gonna basically explain why this entire idea and his arguments here is essentially also wrong. It is just wrong entirely, not dangerous, but just wrong. So yeah, like I said, let's get started.
Labour theory of value suggested that two commodities will trade for the same price if they embody the same amount of labour time, or else they will exchange at a ratio fixed by the relative differences in the two labour times. For instance, if it takes 10 hours to hunt a deer and 20 hours to trap a beaver, then the exchange ratio would be 2 beavers for 1 deer. Since it was developed in the 18th century, the labour theory of value has fallen out of favour amongst most mainstream economists. In summary, as I already mentioned, it means the harder you work, the more you are worth. On the surface, it appears reasonable. Society tells us that if we work hard and focus on our goals, we can achieve anything. Celebrities love to say that. Hell, we all say that because there is an element of truth in it. People who are rich and successful do tend to work longer hours and spend less time watching TV and looking at stupid internet memes. For a full breakdown of this fact, I'll link to Stefan Molyneux's video in the description. Anything worth doing takes effort, from writing a book to making a TV show and even becoming an elite athlete. Hell, it takes effort to get out of bed and go to work in the morning for most people.
I thought I'd probably step in and basically just kind of like essentially just say what Matty's mind in life, or at least like his summary of the labor theory of value, is entirely wrong. The labor theory of value is not essentially a theory that like the more work you put in or like the effort that you put in, you will essentially graduate in life, or you'll essentially get better entirely onto that life. No, it does like that's not essentially what it means. You yourself are essentially not doing that. You're putting in labor and labor time for something that is essentially worth. You are essentially working for a wage, and essentially producing a product that will essentially be sold onto the market by entirely the bourgeois class. And then the bourgeois class, your employer, would essentially give you a wage for that, usually determined onto the labor time or entire other price that the product was essentially sold into the market. They can increase this wage if they wanted to, or they can decrease this wage, determining on how much money they have. And that essentially is what happens, within, and that is like essentially what happens within like kind of like the wage system here in the United States and all over capitalism. They can essentially determine your own wage instead of you yourself basically owning your production or distribution. This is not on the idea that, oh, if you just work hard enough you'll be able to get anywhere. No, that's not what essentially what it believes into. It doesn't necessarily do any, like, it doesn't necessarily kind of like do that. And as for the second point, for bosses essentially working longer hours than workers, um that has actually been debated over and over and time again. Because the problem is here is that, like, It's not the fact that essentially the employer is working longer hours than the worker. The problem is that the employer is essentially giving us is basically exploitive and essentially is exploiting the worker regardless, based onto like the entirety of the wage system and the very essence of like wage work and like the very existence of their class and the entire existence of the workers essentially is being exploitive because the worker is selling their labor power to the employer, and they themselves essentially take the entirety of the product that they produce and then sell that into the market. Uh, and then whatever the money they can essentially get, they can either like determine onto the pricing and pay for like maintenance and resources and all these things, determining that, or they can essentially lower that price and like take out the entirety of like the workers' wages as well, determine on that. This is not essentially them working. This is not them working harder. This is just them essentially, yeah, just making. This is them making a profit out of someone else's labor power. All they're essentially doing here is just doing the math on the pricing of the product and doing the math on what essentially needs to be bought from maintenance, resources, investment, advertisement, and then essentially determining that wage to the worker. They're just doing the math. They're not essentially actually physically doing the labor or producing the entirety of the product. They are just doing the math. Doing the math essentially to basically exploit someone, which I would basically say is, or like it being having an exploitive system, is essentially, I wouldn't necessarily say count that as entirely of a real work. I understand that essentially there's a lot of decision making that essentially has to be made that no one essentially trade for, decision making is not physical working onto the production of a product or onto like production uh into like the entirety of the resource of society. I'm not going to deny that the bourgeois has entirely a role into society, but their role into society is exploitive to another person's and their role in society. That's the problem here. The fact that like their class exists, or the fact that like this class entirely exists, is entirely exploitive and essentially hurts the entirety of like most people in capitalism. That's the problem here. Anyways, moving on.
The Labour Theory of Value proposes that if an entrepreneur sells a widget for $100 and had to pay a worker $50 to make it and purchase $20 of raw materials, the big evil businessman then profits $30. This profit thus represents a theft of the worker's labour because the big evil businessman did no real work for it. The workers made the widget, the entrepreneur just sold it. Why does he get to sit back and steal the profit from all the workers in the factory?
This is a really bad faith analogy. This is a really bad faith analogy that essentially Matty has like essentially pulled up here. First off, at least what I essentially want to essentially clarify as any Marxist, no Marxist calls a bourgeois evil in a way. We don't argue for morality when we're essentially talking about exploitation. These people honestly think that when something is exploitive or exploitation is entirely of a moral argument, that there's essentially of an evil person, paying a horrible wage to entirely of a worker. No, no, no. No, it's not that. It's not the entirety of that. Like, it's not the entirety of that. Steal, like when you say something is being exploited or someone is being exploited, that's them just being exploited. That's just a fact. That's not a moral argument. That's not essentially the determination between good and evil. That's just exploitation regardless. So for this to entirely, I guess, just clarify or him trying to say that this person is evil is just not the case. No one, at least from what I met, Marx, especially himself, they're not saying that these people are evil. They're not saying that these people are bad. But the fact is, their role in society is entirely exploitive, and it is entirely alienating people from their own labor, and taking products and stealing a surplus from production that essentially the worker themselves had done. Yes, like that's not evil, but that is exploited. Of that is entirely of, well, yeah, stealing kind of, or like alienating people from their own labor and stealing a surplus that they themselves essentially put into. That's a problem there. That's the entirety of the problem here. It's not onto morality or not. Furthermore, if we essentially have to do the math, I guess really onto like this entire function, this also essentially determines onto the amount of time or labor time that essentially the worker put into that widget, and also like determining the pricing as well. If they essentially did like I guess an hour to the widget, which costs basically $100, it's even then like once it reaches to the market, that is like essentially when the entirety of the capitalist has to essentially be able to get profit and pay for all of these functions, so they can even determine the price in a higher margin. But if they're facing competition, of course, this can essentially be determined onto like a lower price, but essentially that would mean that they would have to cut the cost of the worker themselves, so that way they can essentially pay for maintenance and all these things, and for that way, and so that way they can essentially save money once the workday is done. So that way they can essentially profit. If they don't do any of these functions, then their business ceases to exist. They would go out of business, basically. Um, and this will essentially come, and I'll essentially come back to this point later, because this is very important to essentially understand on markets, pricing, value, labor theory of value, subjective theory of value, the bourgeois as a class, the proletariat as a class, and even then the bridge between those classes, wage and money. So we'll get back to this entirely later.
See, when they say change the rules, what they really mean is
Go tell the government to point their guns at business and force them into doing what the unions tell them to. It's only fair. They stole your labour.
it's all based on the belief that businesses steal the labour of workers. LTV worshippers don't call what they do stealing though.
What do they call it, Matty?
Collective bargaining. Yeah, those two. They have other words for it like taxation and regulations and fairness and equality and the common good. All Orwellian nonsense for what amounts to pure extortion. It's no coincidence that individuals in the public sector are far more likely to be members of a union compared to those in the private sector. They're also losing members fast in Australia, which is likely why they are pushing for more of that good old extortion while they still can. They need a new victim group to exploit. And they need the government. Marxists always gonna Marx.
This is not even the case, though. When we essentially try to abolish this, we're not calling for a government to essentially get involved with any of this, or that the entirety of a governmental program to just essentially regulate this. No, what we're essentially determining is the entirety of like the gradual abolition of this in the first place. Regardless, we essentially advocate for the entire gradual abolition, or the abolition entirely of these classes, and the entirety for the full liberation of the proletariat. This is not essentially stealing labor, physical labor essentially put in. No, this is entirely stealing this is them stealing a surplus, a value of a surplus that is essentially being stolen based onto like how the worker essentially produced into that. Um, this is like Marxism, or entirety of socialism, what we essentially would count as, or even count as, a worker state, is not even essentially a government really doing. It's not even like a government essentially just doing stuff, or a government essentially planning, or essentially taking on to the economical structures. Nor was that even the case in the Soviet Union, in 1917 to 1924. It was only really until like 1925, or hell, even 1928, when there's entirely of economic planning of a government in the structure, rather than having the entirety of economics to the working class themselves. That was the entirety of the problem here. Because essentially, bureaucracy essentially rose in the entirety of the Soviet Union. That was the problem here. That's the problem. that's the problem that essentially, yeah, I guess that quote unquote workers' state or the socialist state of the horrible Soviet Union essentially faced upon. And like essentially, face horribly. No, the workers' state, and entirely what we understand, or what these people understand as socialism, is not essentially the government doing stuff. So not socialism is essentially a moneyless, classless, stateless society. I've said this over and over again. It has the material insensitive like of society and for one's work. That's socialism. Um, but like the entirety of the workers' state, it entirely puts like productive forces and puts like entirely of production forces and distribution forces to the entirety of the working class themselves, giving their entire existence and giving the majority class to the entirety of the workers and abolishing the state and essentially creating a state essentially controlled by the workers. This essentially can be called a semi-state, or what Lenin and essentially Engels would call it, even a workers' state. A state essentially under the control of the workers. Marx himself never even really said this either. He always like determined it of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Dictatorship not in the literal sense of one man rule, or a group rule. No, what he means by the dictatorship of the proletariat is essentially the proletariat as a class, as the majority of the people, essentially take control onto their production forces and powers and political and politics within their entirety of the state. So that way this kind of like state apparatus can soon even be abolished under the new society in socialism, what was called in the lower phase of communism, and communism, the higher phase of communism. This is this is essentially the idea that this like essentially gets upon, and for for Matty to basically try and like make this kind of like a bad argument, or I guess try and say that this is entirely determined by by kind of like government or governments essentially taking onto the control of this production is just, yeah, no, it is false. And it's not essentially the case, or not entirely of the actual motive for the worker state to essentially be able to function as entirely of a state controlled by the workers. So yeah, moving on.
Morons always conveniently forget is that there is far more that goes into making and selling a product than just labour and raw materials. Let's take the example I used before. The owner sells the widget for $100. He pays his worker $50 to make it and for $20 of raw materials. The gross profit stands at $30. What the labour theory of value fails to take into account is that out of this $30, the entrepreneur has to pay maintenance on his factory, he has to liaise with customers and set up contracts, he may have to make loan repayments. What happens if people no longer want what he's selling? What if there's competition and prices drop, and it wipes out his profit? He has to pay his workers on time every time, and they are always paid first. He may have taken a huge risk starting this business, and he needs to get it right, because if he doesn't, it means taking a large loss or even financial ruin. The labour theory of value also fails to take into account the fact that factory workers need tools and equipment. Without these, the business is worthless, as is their labour. The entrepreneur purchased the equipment with either his own capital or borrowed capital that he must now repay.
Jobs don't.
So this goes back to the point I also originally make while he was essentially making this analogy for, I guess, of the labor theory of value, or this just bad faith analogy of the labor theory of value. And for that, I'm going to essentially answer like the questions I essentially, I guess, produced. So basically what he just decided to do was essentially make that analogy and then move on to it, and then basically make a U-turn all the way back to that analogy, I guess, to somewhat debunk the labor theory of value. Oh, that the horrible Marxist interpretation, despite it actually originating from a classical liberal. So it's funny, but so basically what essentially he's trying to basically say here is that the labor theory of value fails to essentially interpret or essentially kind of like explain how would essentially the capitalist be able to pay for maintenance or pay for entire resources or essentially pay for all of these things and pay for debt, advertisement, all of these functions within the labor theory of value, which even then I already explained how that can essentially happen. And Marx himself even explains this. He can essentially make the price higher within the entirety of capitalism. And he can essentially make that price higher in the entirety of the market, assuming that he doesn't have competition, right? So that way he can essentially be eligible to pay for maintenance, pay for advertisement, pay for investors, and all of these essentially functions that would essentially make his business entirely big. But assuming that there is entirely competition, then yes, he's going to have to lower that price within the entirety of the market. Because the widget is worth $100 based on the labor time. He can increase that within the market, or he can decrease that within the market as well. And if he decreased that into the market, then that means he would have to also cut the wage of the worker, despite the worker essentially producing, that kind of amount, that he already stole half. He can essentially steal more if he can also steal like kind of like the amount of labor time that essentially the worker essentially did produce in. It if it comes to be that it's not profitable or that essentially he needs more money so that way he can pay for various functions for the workday to essentially continue. So he would have to essentially cut. So that means he would essentially have to cut like the entire the wages of the worker, and essentially pay for resources, maintenance, investment, advertisement, and all these things. And if no one essentially wants essentially his product, then he can either do two things. He can either sell a new product, innovate that product, or he can go out of business. Like, you can't essentially already always determine the entirety of these functions, but you have to essentially determine the very narrative on how this works. And what he's basically saying here is that we don't determine onto the mains or any like these functions or the big decision making by the entirety of the bourgeois. We do take that in consideration. However, this is also onto the this can also be done based onto entire like price fixing, either higher or lower within the entirety of the market, so that way they can either get more money from essentially selling the product at a very high price, or they can sell it at a low price, but also take out the wage of the entirety of the worker on what he essentially produced within it. That's the entirety of the problem. That's entirely of what is essentially being said here. There's many decisions that this person can essentially make. Actually, he has the employer, the bourgeois, has that freedom to make decisions and has the freedom to essentially determine onto the price. And that essentially price is usually determined onto the profit motive or a profit basis for the bourgeois essentially give in to. So Matty basically trying to say here that the labor theory of value doesn't take this in consideration is completely false, and you yourself can essentially look into on how pricing is essentially made and just look onto the examples of markets as a function, as an existence of society, and you can just see that the subjective theory of value does not apply and the labor theory of value actually applies more, and if not more, then only applies when we actually determine onto the economic basis, for sure. Anyways, moving on.
No factory equals no job for anyone, and the workers get nothing. How will they feed their families if the factory never existed? If not for this investment, the vast majority of workers around the world would be subsistence farming and living in poverty. In fact, this is what most Westerners were doing just 300 years ago, before we invented the steam engine and found free market capitalism.
Well, I can tell you multiple ways that they can essentially do this. They can essentially create their own kind of factories and essentially create their own class as well, and then essentially, exploit themselves or exploit their entirety of the work of themselves. Essentially, basically creating mutualism, basically a fucked up version of capitalism, I'd say. Or they can essentially abolish the entirety of the essence of markets or entirely of the entire class distinctions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and essentially have their own production and have their own distribution be determined by themselves as a class, as the function of the majority of the people, as humanity, creating a society of freely associated labor that can essentially be determined onto like not capitalism, but socialism or communism. And that essentially has to be onto the idea of on how production or distribution is essentially, or the mode of distribution is essentially made within it. Within socialism, it is entirely a mere material insensitive of society for one individual's in society's work. While in communism, it's from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Either way, they essentially own that production and they own their entire production forces. That's essentially what they can do. And let me tell you, it's probably a lot better than what the fuck we've been doing since capitalism has actually been begun, and or even towards the end of feudalism with slavery and feudalism as that function. Furthermore, poverty to what relation? In feudalism, like if we're talking about like timelines here, in feudalism, this wasn't considered onto poverty. This was essentially just considered onto everyday life. What we essentially know as today, yeah, that might be considered as poverty, but because we essentially had entirely the innovation and we had kind of innovative forces within our function. Poverty is a relative term. And especially since we're talking about economic systems, i.e. history, essentially here, then yeah, no, this entire functions within feudalism wasn't even considered as poverty at the time. This was literally considered as everyday life. It's fucked up that it was, but that's entirely of the actual historical basis that essentially it was considered on. Like capitalism didn't raise billions out of poverty, because the entirety of like the question of poverty during the times of feudalism wasn't even considered as poverty. Only we now consider it as poverty, but that doesn't mean anything, because we now essentially consider that as the poverty, even though they didn't have any economic basis to even do as of so in the first place. That's not raising people out of poverty. That's essentially just the evolvement of society. Period. That's essentially just society moving. That's all it is. That's all we have to essentially understand from this.
Thank God for white people. So long as workers are there of their own free will and not through coercive force, then it is their own choice to make and nobody should stop them. We also need to talk about the widgets themselves. Who invented them? Why are the widgets worth $100? Did they just pop out of thin air? Someone had to come up with the idea, raise the capital, then take the risk and produce these widgets in the hope that someone would purchase their product and they would profit.
So this can be said of the computer, but Bill Gates himself never made Windows 10, or Bill Gates himself didn't make the computer, the Acer Nitro 5 that I'm using right now to make this video. He didn't make that. A worker that was essentially employed by him or employed by someone else that he employed, a manager, essentially produced that. The worker made this computer that I am using now. Steve Jobs didn't make the iPhone. The worker under Steve Jobs did. Period. Someone had to come up with the idea, and they had to essentially get the resources of here. Furthermore, why are you trying to say that capital is essentially tools here? Capital is not tools. It's not any of that functions. I've ranted about this before, like in economical schools. I don't know why they use this term. This should just be called entirely of like essentially, yeah, just tools. Really, there doesn't necessarily be the term here. Capital is essentially just the accumulation of labor. It is an accumulation of labor. That's capital. Anyways, yeah, no. It's Steve Jobs didn't make the iPhone. The worker essentially putting the labor time, putting in like the labor effort, and putting in kind of like the entire insensitive to the iPhone essentially made that as a function. He came up with the idea of it. However, he himself did not create it. This is not entirely of subjective theory of value. This is not subjective because the individual made that. No, there was time and effort and entirely of labor being produced within products, like there always is. And that the only time when it essentially becomes subjective is once it reaches to the market. That's really the only time it essentially reaches on, like, when it becomes subjective in a way. But even then, that subjectivity is still defined by the original value of that product was essentially produced within. This is not essentially done by the individual. This is done by individuals that another individual employed, classes that a bourgeois employed proletarians. That is essentially what's going on here. Anyways, moving on.
It is also not stealing to make a profit, even if you ignore all the additional costs, value-added processes, and the fact that the idea had to come from somewhere. The workers entered freely into an agreement with their employer for the benefit of both parties. Stealing is by definition the taking of property against one's will. If you choose to work at a factory and take the pay on offer, that is not stealing, that's negotiation. Only if either party commits fraud or uses violence, whether individually or via the state, does it become stealing.
No, no, that's entirely not. It isn't. And even then, what we essentially have to understand of stealing here, or essentially labor being stolen, labor power being stolen here, is that yeah, the worker themselves did freely essentially get into the employment sector, and they themselves did get into that employment sector, not voluntarily, however, but because they were under the threat of poverty themselves. If they don't work, then they themselves would essentially go into poverty. There's no entire material incentive or any form of governmental body or any society that essentially would determine these workers or these people to essentially be able to basically work or essentially be able to have a life without essentially under the threat of poverty. Capitalism doesn't do that. If you don't work, and if you don't work entirely for a wage, and if you don't sell your labor power, you will die. You will essentially become homeless. You will essentially be going into poverty, and you essentially have to essentially pay for certain programs that you can't afford because you're not essentially selling your labor power. This is not voluntarily working. No. Society as a function and the entirety of society is making them sell their labor power. The very system, the very economical structure that essentially capitalism produces makes them work, makes them essentially have to sell their labor power to an employer. That's the entirety of the problem here. This is not them voluntarily doing all these things. When a slave is essentially bought and sold from one to another, they essentially can basically say, oh, I accept this because because this person is essentially a little bit better than my last owner. That's still slavery regardless, that is still slavery. And even then, they essentially have to essentially be bought and sold themselves as a person, or else they themselves have no function in society, and they would most likely die and not be fed by an owner. So, it's still slavery. Even if they essentially are freely essentially willing to do this, no, it's still slavery regardless. And even here, the definition of stealing is based onto not one's will. Well, they don't even. Here's the thing though. Yeah, they don't. Yeah, they essentially gave their will up, but the thing is, they don't even have the will to essentially be free in the first place. Society is essentially making them work for this because there's no essential backup, or there's no essential systematic there's no systematic kind of way to basically help these people if they essentially don't work. The threats of poverty is essentially the threat of poverty is essentially a gun up to their head. And if they don't essentially work for a certain amount of time, or if they don't sell their labor power, then they themselves will be shot by the bullet of poverty. That's essentially the problem here, and that's entirely what we have to understand, at least of here, and what we have to understand why we call this surplus stealing, or stealing of the surplus, entirely the surplus value of the worker. That the worker themselves essentially produced within society. So yeah. Anyways, moving on.
This is the subjective theory of value. This is the idea that an object's value is not inherent, and is instead worth more to different people based on how much they desire or need the object. The subjective theory of value places value on how scarce and useful an item is, rather than basing the value of the object on how many resources and man-hours went into creating it. For example, land is valuable because you can build a house on it, and that offers things people need, such as shelter and territory. The exact price depends entirely on individuals purchasing the land and building houses.
Building houses, keep in mind, and even then that land essentially is bought and sold based onto the cultivation and the entirety of how hard essentially that land was essentially to purchase or even to get or to be owned in the first place. And even then this is not essentially determined by the individual. You don't bargain for entirely of the price when you're buying land. No, a price is already set. You just have to pay for it. You don't go to a grocery store and literally just get a carton of milk and basically just say, yeah, this says $10, but I'm gonna pay $9 instead. You don't do that. That's not possible. We are not under times of feudalism. This is entirely capitalism. A price is already set in motion. So even we're taking this example in place, even if we're to build a house in said land, that has to take in time, and that has to take labor time and labor for that house to essentially be made, and essentially to cultivate the land to cultivate the land in the first place for labor for essentially a house to be built in the first place. So not everything is subjective here. The value is not entirely subjective by the individual, because you clearly don't see that at all in any practice at all when it comes to pricing or when it comes to selling or buying products. It's only subjective onto the market, but the consumer themselves don't determine the price. The seller does. Anyways, moving on.
Produces and what a bad chef produces is obvious to everyone, and it's reflected in the price of the food in most cases. A bad chef can take already valuable foods like fruit and eggs and destroy all their value through poor processes. A good chef could take the exact same ingredients and turn them into a masterpiece of flavour. The effort and labour they put into their work has little bearing on its value.
But there's entirely of an effort to make those dishes in the first place. So there is a bearing within it, into this, and it's not little is the definition onto this value for this to entirely happen. The bad chef clearly did not put up onto enough effort as the good chef did into this example. So Jesus, man. Anyways, let's just fucking move on.
What Nicky Oppenheimer actually said. Diamonds are intrinsically worthless, except for the deep psychological need they fill. That deep psychological need is the need for a lady to feel special and show her status with something shiny. It's also a symbolic gesture of the man paying for something really, really expensive, but ultimately worthless to his woman in any practical sense.
Isn't that...
No, not really. I mean, that is essentially kind of the culture that we essentially are adopted with when it comes to weddings. We have to buy the woman, very fancy ring with a diamond on it, and it's like, oh my god, bro, that's so cool. And then she can show it off to her later friends. But even then, that's not essentially the case. That's not the only use for diamonds. You do realize diamonds are one of the most worthful tools that essentially can be used for mining companies, and essentially for entire tools to be made to essentially smelt more resources within the ground, and also essentially produce various other products within it. And besides, again, there has to essentially be labor or effort put into the diamond, and for the finding of the diamond in the first place, to cultivate that diamond, to preserve that diamond, and to import that diamond to the rest of the world. That's essentially also that takes into the labor power and the labor time put into the diamond. So this is also wrong here, or at least that it tries to fill its logical need. It does do that. However, for the value of it is not defined by the individual, is defined by the employer and the entirety, and that employer essentially has to determine that price based on the value that essentially it is based onto the labor time that essentially is produced. Even liberals agree on this. I don't know what to say. So,
Rich in a free market capitalist economy because they offer a great deal of value to other people in it, not because they stole anyone's labour. The value is subjective and based on the needs and wants of the people within it. Nobody knows what people are going to buy or what they are going to spend their money on until they actually do it. We all have free will. Well,
Yeah, yeah, we do have free will, and even then, for this pricing to essentially be determined, or for any of this, and for any of this to essentially happen, or for and for like the entirety of a product to be determined or to be sold entirely within a market, has to essentially be determined, or has to be essentially onto the understanding that there was entirely of labor put into said product, and there essentially has to be a function within like the product that essentially drives the pricing that is today through labor time that's essentially put into said product. So again, Matty is essentially just wrong here.
Henry Ford invested in plant and equipment to mass produce cars cheap enough that ordinary people could buy them. The world benefited greatly from his risk-taking, and now ordinary people all over the world have access to the value of private mechanical transportation.
Because it was profitable. Literally, Henry Ford was not one to essentially just just essentially give all this functions. Henry Ford is also the guy that popularized the Saturday no work day. He didn't do this because he wanted essentially his workers to feel good, or essentially he wanted essentially just workers to do all these things. He did it so that way more people essentially can go to his like entire workplace and be employed by it, and also for his workers to buy a car. That's essentially like why he did it for. He didn't essentially do that. He didn't essentially do this because it was a good thing for him to do. No, he did this because it was entirely profitable for him. And for him to essentially make that pricing cheap within the entirety of the market for cars is also very profitable for him, because he essentially benefits at the end, and more people essentially can buy it, and he can essentially profit from that. And even then, it takes in labor and labor time put in to make the car in the first place. It takes someone to build the car. Henry Ford doesn't make the car himself. The workers that he employs do. So that's one thing that essentially I also understand of Henry Ford.
The idea that big, evil, bad capitalist pigman somehow steals the labour of his workers is rubbish. Not only is it false, it's a theory used to justify the mass murder of more than 100 million people in less than 1 century. Those who still claim to believe this nonsense are either horribly ignorant of reality, dishonest, or truly malevolent.
No, we're not doing any of these functions. Besides, a lot of those death tolls and a lot of like this entire death or millions essentially being killed is usually essentially determined like based on like by the Black Book of Communism, which even then the authors even admitted that a lot of deaths were exaggerated and essentially propagated and like falsified, so that way it can be able as a propaganda scheme or like a propaganda media source for essentially people to read about quote unquote communism in that is essentially a function within the world, so that way they're less able to essentially be communist themselves. So that doesn't necessarily even make sense there at all either. And yeah, furthermore, again, we're not saying that these people are evil, that the bourgeoisie is essentially evil in a way, but the fact that essentially their function as a class exists is entirely exploitive. That's not saying that they're evil. We're not moralists. We're not being moral here. We're basically just determining onto the economical factor that this is essentially propagated within it. Period. Anyways, moving on. Never mind. That was really the entirety of the video, or at least what was actually worth essentially responding to the video as well. So yeah, basically, conclusion here that the subjective theory of value, or the idea of the subjective theory of value, is entirely bullshit, and really, the labor theory of value, essentially what we understand here as an economical function of value, essentially determined under capitalism, is really the only really function that essentially how value is essentially determined under capitalism, really. And this can only subjective theory of value can only be applied when these entire functions, when markets and all of these functions essentially abolish, and we essentially move on to a production for use. Which capitalism does not do, because this entire production is entirely for exchange value and exchange to be made. So that's our conclusion here. If you like this video, hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the if you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I'll also very much appreciate it. And yeah, thank you for watching this video. So yeah, Socialist Links is out.